So, welcome to day 3 of the 30 days, 30 tools to manage stress and prevent burnout in medicine. And the tool on day 3 is knowledge. So, knowledge of when stress becomes burnout. So, stress is what happens when we perceive threats that we can manage are greater than our resources to deal with us. And this involves our reptilian nervous system and our vagal nerve. And the function of this is to avoid harm through our fight, flight, or freeze nervous system. And as we have all experienced in busy medical lives, that stress can actually be beneficial, can be energizing, and enhance our performance and our concentration. But there becomes a point, that bell-shaped curve, or that edge, where we go into that sympathetic overdrive or dorsal vagal nerve collapse. And the other way of explaining that is that we have these 3 zones. So the first zone is our zone of safety, and that's normally when our parasympathetic nervous system is on board, and then we push ourselves. So this is kind of an analogy in yin yoga. Actually, as you go into a stretch in yin yoga, you stretch yourself into that zone of challenge, and when you're stretching in the zone of challenge or stretching yourself in your life emotionally, your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system are in balance, and that is called heart rate variability. And there's a lot of studies about that this is what resilience is when we can find that place in our zone of challenge and maintain that. But then we can easily tip into our zone of overwhelm, which is either the kind of flight or fight, that sympathetic overwhelm, or it is that dorsal vagal nerve collapse, which is when we have the freeze and appease. So the need, even though we're totally exhausted, to keep on pleasing other people in our lives when we're in burnout. And so burnout is when we go into the zone of overwhelm as a result of workplace stress, and we experience these symptoms. And so the official kind of definition of that is that we experience kind of that sense of emotional exhaustion and energy depletion, which can be kind of that freeze kind of symptoms. Also that depersonalization and feeling of, even though you used to be really passionate and love your job, that you're not so involved and you have this kind of mental distance from it. And then that is also that even though you're keeping on, you're going into your job day after day, you're not actually getting achieved what you used to be able to achieve. So you have that reduced sense of accomplishment, and there's a kind of like an irritability or an anxiety that's kind of accompanied with that. And the causes of burnout are basically divided into 3 things, or I actually do it through the kind of polyvagal theory that we have been talking about. So if you think of us as a nervous system that we are needing to regulate to not go into that zone of overwhelm, we have factors that are external to our nervous system that are putting us into that. So the systemic factors, the things that are usually kind of a little bit out of our control, even though we wish that they weren't. So things like workload, autonomy, not having any control over your day-to-day life, having middle managers, did I say that? And also that kind of moral sense of injury, not being able to provide what you want to be able to provide according to your training and evidence-based medicine, in this kind of COVID climate or funding crisis, that fairness and inequity that you can experience in the workplace as well. Sometimes still that gender difference in the workplace, technology as well can be a systemic factor. So all of those things that are familiar to you can cause us burnout as well. Then there are factors that are internal to our nervous system. So things that we, so basically we, as women in medicine, a lot of us are perfectionists and may have an internal critic that beats us up on a regular basis about not being good enough and thinking that we're going to make a mistake. And this internal critic can actually, research has shown, can actually put us into that flight or fight nervous system. So the way that we talk to ourselves can put us into that. So that imposter syndrome that we have, so that can put us in with the fighting part, the beating ourselves up, the feeling that we are the only ones that are experiencing this, feeling like that we're the only ones that are feeling that imposter and beating ourselves up, and also kind of like that freeze part is when we become stuck to our thoughts. So our own thought processes can also put us into that zone and contribute to our own burnout. So that's where doing some kind of acceptance and commitment therapy or kinds of therapy or doing a mindful self-compassion course with me can help us with that part of burnout. And then we have the in-between nervous system courses, which I talked about yesterday, about how we pick up on other people's stress as well as our own stress. So to be aware of that kind of empathetic resonance or that empathetic distress in our own bodies, that's also contributing to a burnout, and that to have kind of compassion for the fact that our stress is not just our own stress and that we're picking up on other people's stress. So yeah, those are the factors about that kind of knowledge about when stress becomes burnout. And burnout is becoming something. The last research that I looked at showed that the increased prevalence pre-COVID and post-COVID, it's gone from like 42% to about 55%. It has actually been increasing in women in medicine. A lot of people in the 40 to 55-year-old age group, particularly those in multiple caregiving roles and those that have kind of that sandwich generation. And also maybe is probably across all professions, but maybe more in primary care, emergency and psychiatry. So it is something that we need to be looking at and be aware of and have knowledge of, and start to ask ourselves, maybe, are there any symptoms that we may be experiencing? Maybe looking at playing our age and knowing, and we'll talk about how we do that in the next 30 days, knowing where our age is between when stress is energizing and motivating for us and we're in that zone of challenge, and when we get into that zone of overwhelm. So I'll give you tools to deal with that. So thank you for joining me on day 3. I'm trying to keep these kind of short, but they keep on getting up to 9 minutes. So anyway, namaste. I'll see you on day 4. Bye.
If you want to learn more about the Mind Fitness Doctor, then download my free ebook, The Stress Reset Toolbox for Women in Medicine, or join me in my 6-week Mindful Self-Compassion for Medicine course, or the 8-week Mind Fit Doctor course, How to Manage Stress and Prevent Burnout in Medicine, the Mind Fitness Gym membership for Women in Medicine, or my Recharge Retreat.